"You missed a spot," the man said, not even looking up from his phone as he nudged the ceramic mug with his shoe, sending a thin stream of coffee across the polished staff room floor. And for a second, no one questioned it. Not the two teachers leaning against the counter, not the woman stirring sugar into her cup, not even the assistant who let out a quiet chuckle under the low fluorescent hum. They all saw the same thing he did. A black woman standing near the doorway in a simple navy coat. Silent, out of place, easy to label, easy to dismiss. And Ava Johnson felt every eye settle on her like a quiet verdict, felt the weight of assumptions press in without a single word needing to be spoken. But she didn't move right away, her fingers hovering just inches from the spill, as if time itself had slowed, as if the room had stretched around that one moment. The man finally glanced up, impatient now, tapping his foot lightly against the tile. "Hello? We don't have all day." And someone behind him added, barely above a whisper but loud enough to carry, "They never do," followed by a soft ripple of laughter that bounced off the lockers and cabinets, thin and sharp, and Ava bent slightly at the waist, not quite kneeling, not quite complying, just enough to let them believe she would, her hand lowering halfway before stopping again, suspended, steady, her reflection faintly visible in the gloss of the floor beneath the spreading stain. Outside, the narrow window, the morning sun cut across the campus in long golden lines, students moving between classes, unaware of the quiet judgment unfolding behind closed doors, unaware that inside this room, a line had just been drawn without anyone noticing it. Ava's breath came slow and even, her shoulders relaxed, her posture unbroken, and when she finally straightened, it wasn't sudden, it wasn't dramatic, just deliberate, controlled, enough to shift something in the air that no one could quite name, the laughter thinning, the room tightening by a fraction, the man's expression flickering with the smallest hint of confusion as she met his gaze for the first time, calm, unwavering, not angry, not defensive, just present in a way that made the silence stretch longer than it should have. A clock ticked somewhere on the wall, each second louder now, sharper, until Ava spoke, her voice low, steady, almost gentle. "You might want to remember this moment." And no one laughed this time. No one moved. The words hanging in the air like something unfinished, something waiting, and just beyond the door, the hallway bell rang, cutting through the tension like a signal no one had expected. The bell echoed down the hallway, long and sharp, and the room seemed to exhale all at once as chairs shifted and footsteps hesitated. But Ava did not move toward the door like the others. She simply reached into her bag and pulled out a folded sheet of paper, smoothing it once with the side of her hand, as if grounding herself in something real, while the teachers exchanged glances that carried more curiosity now than amusement. Mr. Carter clearing his throat as he straightened his tie, suddenly, aware of the way the moment had shifted without explanation. "Staff meeting," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else, already stepping past her, careful this time not to brush against her shoulder, and one by one they filed out into the corridor where lockers lined the walls and student voices faded into distant echoes. But the energy followed them, that quiet tension that had not quite resolved. Ava walking behind them at an unhurried pace, her heels making a soft, steady rhythm against the polished floor, each step measured, each breath even, as if she had already seen how this would unfold. The auditorium doors stood open ahead, wide and welcoming, rows of seats filling quickly with faculty, the stage lit by overhead panels that cast a clean, almost clinical glow across the podium at center, and Ava paused just before entering, her eyes lifting briefly to take in the room, the banners along the walls, the school colors, the framed photographs of past principals staring down with practiced authority, and for a moment, just a moment, something flickered across her face, not doubt, not hesitation, but memory, like a quiet echo of all the years it had taken to stand exactly here. Inside, the teachers found their usual spots, forming clusters out of habit, whispering in low voices that carried fragments of speculation. Who was she? Did you hear what she said? Probably just a parent. The words drifting but never quite reaching her as she stepped through the doorway and moved along the side aisle instead of joining the crowd, her presence still unnoticed by most, invisible in the way people become when others decide not to see them. On stage, The superintendent adjusted the microphone, tapping it once. The sound ringing out across the room and pulling attention forward. Conversations cutting off mid-sentence as heads turned in unison, the atmosphere settling into expectation. And somewhere near the front, Mr. Carter leaned toward Mrs. Whitmore, his voice lower now. "Strange morning," he said, though he did not look convinced by his own dismissal, his eyes flicking briefly toward the aisle where Ava stood, still, composed, her hands resting lightly at her sides. The superintendent smiled, a practiced, confident expression, and began to speak about leadership, about change, about the importance of vision in shaping the future of the school, each word measured, each pause intentional, building something the room could not yet see. And as the speech unfolded, Ava took one step forward, then another, moving closer to the stage but not yet stepping into the light, remaining just at the edge where shadow met brightness, where perception shifted and truth waited to be revealed, and in that quiet space between who they thought she was and who she actually was, the entire room held its breath without even realizing it. The superintendent's voice carried across the auditorium with a calm authority, each word landing with deliberate weight as he spoke about transition, about the need for leadership that understood both discipline and compassion. And in the rows below, teachers sat straighter, some nodding, others distracted, but all listening just enough to sense that something important was unfolding, even if they could not yet name it. Mr. Carter folded his arms, his gaze drifting again toward the side aisle, where Ava now stood closer than before, her figure no longer blending into the background, her presence quietly insisting on being seen. And for a brief second, recognition tried to surface in his expression before he pushed it aside, choosing instead the comfort of assumption. On stage, the superintendent paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to draw every eye forward, his hand resting lightly on the podium as he scanned the room. Then he smiled again, softer this time, almost personal. "This school has always been a place of tradition," he said, "but today, we begin something new." And the air shifted, subtle but unmistakable, like the moment before a storm breaks or a curtain rises. Ava took another step forward, the light catching the edge of her face now, revealing the calm steadiness in her eyes, the quiet confidence that had never needed to announce itself. And still, no one spoke, no one interrupted, because something about her movement carried a certainty that silenced even the most restless whispers. Mrs. Whitmore leaned slightly toward Mr. Carter, her voice barely audible. "Do you know her?" she asked, but he did not answer right away, his attention fixed, his earlier certainty slipping just enough to let doubt in. And across the room, a few others began to notice as well, heads turning, brows narrowing, small shifts that rippled outward like circles in water. The superintendent adjusted the microphone once more, the soft feedback hum cutting through the stillness. And then he said, "Leadership is not about titles. It is about presence, about the ability to stand in a room and be seen for who you truly are." And as he spoke, his eyes moved deliberately toward the aisle, toward Ava, and followed by instinct. So did everyone else's. She did not rush, did not hesitate. She simply walked forward, each step measured, the sound of her heels echoing lightly against the floor, and with every step, the space between perception and reality narrowed until it could no longer hold, until the version of her they had created began to fracture under the weight of who she actually was. Mr. Carter's posture shifted, his arms uncrossing without him realizing it, his expression tightening, not from anger, but from something quieter, something closer to realization, as pieces began to align in ways he could not yet fully accept. Ava reached the front row and stopped, not yet stepping onto the stage, not yet claiming the spotlight, but close enough now that there was no mistaking her place in the moment. And the superintendent's voice lowered slightly, drawing the room in as if sharing something meant only for those willing to listen. "Today," he said, "we welcome someone who understands this school not just from the outside, but from every layer within it." And the words settled over the room like a quiet truth, undeniable, waiting, as Ava lifted her gaze to meet his, and for the first time since she had entered the building, she allowed the faintest hint of a smile to touch her lips, not in triumph, not in pride, but in recognition of a moment that had already been written long before anyone else realized they were part of it. The room had gone completely still now, the kind of silence that pressed against the ears, heavy and undeniable, as the superintendent stepped slightly back from the podium and turned his body toward Ava with quiet intention, his hand extending in a gesture that no longer left space for doubt. And in that single motion, everything shifted, every assumption, every careless word from minutes ago, every glance that had reduced her to something smaller than she was. Ava did not rush to meet him. She walked with the same measured pace, each step echoing softly across the auditorium floor, the sound clear now in the absence of whispers. And as she reached the edge of the stage, the light fell fully across her face, revealing not just composure but authority, the kind that did not need to be announced to be felt. Mr. Carter felt his throat tighten, his earlier confidence dissolving into something unfamiliar, his mind replaying the moment in the staff room with uncomfortable clarity. The tone of his voice, the way he had not even looked at her, and beside him, Mrs. Whitmore shifted in her seat, her posture no longer relaxed, her gaze fixed forward as if looking anywhere else would make it worse. On stage, the superintendent allowed the moment to breathe, his eyes moving across the room, acknowledging the attention he had gathered before finally speaking again, his voice steady, deliberate. It is my honor to introduce someone who has spent years understanding what this school truly needs, someone who has walked its halls not for recognition, but for purpose. And a ripple moved through the audience, not of sound, but of realization beginning to form, incomplete but unavoidable. Ava stepped up onto the stage, the slight elevation changing everything, not just physically but symbolically, placing her above the very people who had dismissed her only moments before. And still, she did not look at them. She did not search for reactions or validation. Her focus remained forward, anchored, as if she had already accepted this moment long before it arrived. The superintendent turned slightly toward her, his expression respectful now, almost deferential. And then he said the words that settled the truth into place. Please join me in welcoming your new principal, Ms. Ava Johnson. And this time, there was no laughter, no whisper, only the quiet sound of breath being drawn in across the room. A collective pause as reality replaced assumption. Mr. Carter's hands lowered to his sides, his fingers curling slightly, as if trying to grasp something already gone, his gaze dropping for a fraction of a second before lifting again, unable to avoid what stood in front of him now. And around him, others mirrored the same reaction, small shifts, lowered eyes, tightened expressions, the unmistakable weight of recognition settling in. Ava stood beside the podium, the light framing her in stillness, her presence filling the space without effort. And when she finally looked out at them, her eyes moved across the room not with judgment, not with anger, but with clarity, the kind that saw everything and chose what to carry forward. And in that gaze, the room felt smaller, quieter, as if every person understood without being told that something had changed, something irreversible, something that could not be undone by apology or explanation, only by what came next. Ava stepped forward to the podium, her hand resting lightly against the smooth wood as the microphone picked up the faint sound of her breath, steady and controlled. And for a moment, she said nothing, letting the silence stretch just long enough for every person in the room to feel it, to sit in it, to recognize the weight of what had just happened without her needing to explain it. The superintendent moved aside, giving her the space fully now, no longer the center, and Ava's gaze swept across the audience, not searching, not accusing, simply seeing. And when her eyes passed over Mr. Carter, there was no pause, no acknowledgement of the earlier moment, only the same calm presence that had unsettled him before. Only now it carried something more, something undeniable. She adjusted the microphone slightly, the soft scrape echoing, and then she spoke, her voice clear, even, filling the room without force. "Good morning," she said, and the simplicity of it grounded the moment, brought it back from tension into something real, something human. "I know this is unexpected. For many of you," she continued, her tone measured, each word deliberate. "But I believe the most important moments often are." And a few heads shifted, a few shoulders straightened, the room leaning in despite itself. Ava's fingers rested lightly along the edge of the podium, not gripping, not tense, just present, as she went on. This school is more than its policies, more than its test scores, more than its reputation. And she paused, letting the words settle. It is the people who walk these halls every day, the students who are still learning who they are, and the educators who shape what they believe is possible. And there was something in the way she said it, something that carried lived understanding rather than distant theory, something that made even the most skeptical listeners hesitate before dismissing her. Mr. Carter shifted in his seat again, the sound of fabric against plastic louder to him than it should have been, his earlier certainty replaced by a quiet discomfort he could not shake. And beside him, Mrs. Whitmore kept her eyes forward, her posture rigid, as if stillness could protect her from the awareness creeping in. Ava continued, her voice never rising, never sharp, but firm in a way that did not allow interruption. Respect is not a policy we write down, she said. It is something we show in the smallest moments, the ones we think do not matter. And this time, the words landed differently, closer, sharper without needing to be, and a few people glanced at one another before quickly looking away. Ava did not linger on it, did not press. She simply moved forward. My role here is not to change who you are, but to remind you why you chose to be here in the first place. And there was a quiet honesty in that statement, something that softened the edges of the room, even as it held them accountable. She stepped slightly back from the podium then, not retreating but creating space again, her presence still steady, still grounded. And in that moment, it became clear that she was not there to prove anything, not to them, not to anyone. She was there because she already belonged, because she had always belonged, and the realization settled in. Slowly, deeply, across the room, changing the way they saw her, and perhaps more importantly, the way they saw themselves. The room did not erupt into applause, not right away, and that absence of sound felt more powerful than any reaction, like the space itself was asking everyone to sit with what had just been said, to process it without distraction, and Ava allowed that silence to remain, her hands now resting calmly at her sides, her posture unchanged, grounded, as if she had already accepted that real change never came with immediate noise, only with quiet recognition. A chair creaked somewhere in the middle, rose, then another, small movements breaking the stillness, people adjusting not just physically but internally, shifting in ways they could not fully articulate. And near the front, Mr. Carter lowered his gaze for a moment, his eyes tracing the edge of his shoe against the polished floor, catching a faint reflection that brought back the image of the spilled coffee, the assumption he had made without thinking. And the memory did not sit the same anymore. It pressed differently now, heavier, harder to ignore. Ava stepped slightly away from the podium, not retreating but allowing the moment to open, her presence no longer confined to a single point on the stage, and she looked out again, her eyes moving across faces that were no longer as certain as they had been minutes ago. And when she spoke again, her voice softened just slightly, not weaker, but more human, more connected. I have walked these halls before, she said, not in this role, but in ways that taught me more than any title ever could. And that line landed gently, but it carried depth, something layered beneath the surface that invited them to listen differently. A few teachers leaned forward, almost unconsciously, drawn in by the shift in tone, and Ava continued. I have seen what happens when a student feels invisible, when a voice is dismissed before it is even heard. And she paused, her gaze steady. And I have also seen what happens when someone chooses to see them anyway. And the words settled into the room like something familiar, something many had witnessed, but not always acknowledged. Mrs. Whitmore's shoulders dropped slightly, her rigid posture easing just enough to reveal the tension beneath, her eyes no longer fixed in defense but in thought. And across the aisle, another teacher nodded once, almost imperceptibly, as if recognizing a truth they had been avoiding. Ava took a slow breath, the microphone catching the quiet inhale, and then she said, This is not about changing everything overnight. Her voice calm, steady. It is about choosing, moment by moment, to lead with awareness, with respect, with the understanding that every interaction shapes more than we realize. And there was no accusation in her tone, no direct reference to what had happened earlier, and yet the message reached exactly where it needed to, landing with precision without ever naming its target. The superintendent watched from the side, his expression thoughtful now, observing not just the words but the effect, the way the room was responding without resistance, the way the tension was shifting into something quieter, something more reflective. Ava let her words fade naturally, not filling the silence immediately, allowing space again for it to breathe, for it to settle. And in that stillness, something subtle changed, something internal, as if the room itself had taken a step forward without moving. And for the first time since she had walked into the building, the distance between who she was and how they saw her had begun to close, not through force, not through confrontation, but through something far more powerful, the quiet, undeniable presence of truth. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted, slowly, like something loosening its grip, and then a single clap sounded from the back of the room, hesitant, uncertain, followed by another, and then a few more, scattered at first, uneven, until it gathered into something fuller, something real, and Ava did not react to the applause the way many would have. She did not smile wider or nod in acknowledgement. She simply stood there, steady, receiving it without letting it define the moment. Because what mattered had already happened before the first clap ever began. Mr. Carter felt his hands come together almost on their own, the motion automatic, but his expression remained tight, his mind still caught in the earlier moment, replaying it now with a clarity that left no room for excuse. And as the applause continued, he stopped clapping before the others did, his hands lowering slowly, his gaze fixed on the stage, on Ava, as if trying to reconcile two versions of the same person that no longer aligned. Ava stepped slightly away from the podium again, allowing the superintendent to return briefly, his voice offering a few closing remarks about leadership and transition. But the room was no longer listening in the same way. Their attention remained anchored to her, to what she had said, to what they had just witnessed unfold in front of them. When the meeting was dismissed, the chairs shifted again. But this time the movement carried a different energy, quieter, more deliberate, people rising more slowly, conversations starting and stopping before they fully formed, as if no one was quite sure how to speak yet. Ava stepped down from the stage with the same calm pace she had carried throughout, her heels touching the floor with soft precision, and as she moved toward the aisle, the space in front of her opened without anyone needing to be asked, people stepping aside instinctively, not out of fear, but out of recognition. Mrs. Whitmore was the first to move toward her, her steps careful, measured, her expression composed but no longer guarded. And when she reached Ava, she paused for a brief second, choosing her words with more care than she had earlier that morning. "Ms. Johnson," she said, her voice quieter now. "I did not realize," and the sentence lingered, unfinished, not because she did not know how to complete it, but because the meaning was already clear. Ava met her gaze, her expression unchanged, not cold, not warm, simply present, and she gave a small nod, acknowledging the moment without expanding it, without turning it into something larger than it needed to be. And then she moved past her, continuing forward without waiting for more. Behind them, Mr. Carter stood still for a second longer than everyone else, watching, his shoulders slightly tense, as if something inside him was still deciding whether to act. And then finally, he stepped forward, his pace slower than the others, more deliberate, his voice catching just slightly when he spoke. "Ms. Johnson," he said, and Ava stopped, turning just enough to face him, giving him the space to speak. He hesitated, just for a moment, the weight of the earlier scene pressing against his words, and then he said, "About earlier." But he did not finish, because the explanation he had prepared no longer felt sufficient, no longer matched the clarity of the moment, and Ava watched him quietly, her gaze steady, giving him the opportunity but not the direction. And in that pause, something shifted again, not in the room this time, but within him, something quieter, something that did not need to be spoken out loud to be understood. The moment stretched between them, quiet but heavy, as Mr. Carter stood there with words that refused to come together the way he intended, his posture no longer carrying the same authority it had just an hour ago. And for the first time, he looked directly at Ava without assumption, without dismissal, just awareness, and that alone changed something in the space between them. Ava held his gaze, not challenging, not softening, simply present, giving him the space to finish what he had started, but not rescuing him from it either. And after a brief pause, he exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just slightly as he said, "I was wrong." The words quiet, almost unfamiliar on his tongue, but clear enough to be heard, and there was no excuse attached, no attempt to soften it. Just the statement itself, standing on its own. Ava nodded once, a small, controlled motion, acknowledging what had been said without expanding it into something larger, without turning it into a moment of judgment or triumph. And in that restraint, there was something more powerful than any response he had expected, something that left no room for defensiveness, only reflection. Around them, the hallway had begun to clear, the earlier tension dissolving into a softer hum of movement, footsteps fading, doors opening and closing in the distance, but the shift remained. Subtle yet present, carried in the way people glanced a little longer, spoke a little more carefully, as if the morning had rewritten something they had not realized was still unfinished. Mrs. Whitmore stood a few steps away, watching the exchange, her expression no longer guarded but thoughtful, and when Ava moved past Mr. Carter, continuing down the hallway, she stepped forward slightly, her voice steady this time. "If there is anything I can do to support your transition," she said, choosing her words with intention, "please let me know." And Ava paused just briefly, turning her head enough to acknowledge her, her response measured. "There will be," she said, not as a promise or a demand, but as a simple truth, and then she continued walking. The administrative office came into view at the end of the corridor, the door partially open, the brass plate beside it catching the afternoon light, and as Ava approached, the secretary inside looked up, her expression shifting from routine, focused to something more attentive, more aware, rising from her chair as Ava stepped inside. "Good morning, Miss Johnson," she said, her tone respectful, certain, and Ava returned a small nod, her presence settling into the space as if it had always belonged there. Behind her, the hallway grew quieter, the echoes of earlier voices replaced by something more subdued, more thoughtful, and Mr. Carter remained where he stood for a moment longer, his gaze following her until she disappeared into the office, the weight of the morning still present, but no longer confusing, no longer something to dismiss. And as he finally turned to leave, his steps slower, more deliberate, there was a subtle shift in the way he carried himself, not visible to everyone, but real nonetheless, something internal, something that would shape what came next. Inside the office, Ava paused just inside the doorway, her hand resting lightly against the frame for a brief second, not out of hesitation, but recognition, as if acknowledging the path that had led her here, every unseen moment, every quiet decision, every time she had chosen to remain steady when it would have been easier not to. And then she stepped fully inside, the door closing softly behind her, leaving the hallway in silence once again. The office settled into a quiet stillness as the door closed behind her, the faint click echoing softly against the walls before fading into silence. And Ava stood there for a moment, not moving, not rushing to sit or speak, just allowing the space to exist around her. The desk in front of her polished and untouched, the chair positioned perfectly behind it, the nameplate resting at the edge, angled just enough to catch the light. She stepped forward slowly, her fingertips brushing lightly across the surface of the desk, feeling the smooth grain beneath her skin, grounding herself in the reality of the moment, not as something sudden, but as something earned, something built over years that no one in that staff room had seen. Outside the large window, the campus stretched wide under the afternoon sun, students crossing between buildings, laughter rising and falling in the distance, life continuing as it always had, unaware that something fundamental had shifted inside these walls. Ava reached the chair and paused again before sitting, her gaze lowering briefly to the nameplate, the engraved letters. Clear and simple, Principal Ava Johnson, and for a second, the room felt smaller, more intimate, as if holding that truth quietly between its walls. She sat down with calm precision, adjusting slightly, her posture straight, composed, and the chair did not feel unfamiliar. It felt natural, like a place she had already occupied in her mind long before it became real. A soft knock came at the door, and the secretary stepped in gently, placing a small stack of folders on the desk, her movements respectful, measured. "These are the files for this week," she said, her voice calm. and Ava nodded. "Thank you." Her tone even, steady, and the secretary lingered just a second longer than necessary before offering a small, genuine smile, one that did not carry assumption, only recognition, and then she stepped out, closing the door softly once more. Ava opened the top folder, her eyes scanning the pages with quiet focus, but her attention was not rushed, not overwhelmed, each detail absorbed, with the same presence she had carried all morning. And as she read, the faint reflection of the window light moved across the desk, shifting slowly with the passing clouds outside. Somewhere down the hallway, footsteps passed, voices murmured, doors opened and closed. But inside the office, the atmosphere remained steady, anchored, as if the space itself had adjusted to her presence. Ava closed the folder gently and leaned back slightly, her gaze lifting once more toward the window, watching the movement of students below. And there was no need for words, no need for explanation. Only the quiet understanding that the moment in the staff room had not been an end, but a beginning, something that would echo forward in ways no one could fully see yet. Her hand rested lightly on the desk, her breathing slow, even, and in the reflection of the glass, her figure stood clear, no longer shaped by assumption, no longer defined by how others had chosen to see her, but by something deeper, something steady and unshaken. And in that stillness, the room held a kind of silence that did not feel empty, but complete, like a story that did not need to say anything more to be fully understood.